Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having us today. I'm Taunton Payne. I'm the director of the Scientific Data Sharing Policy Division in the Office of Science Policy at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. And I'm joined by my colleague, Cindy Danielson. And our plan for today is that we're going to go over the data management and sharing policy that was issued by NIH in October 2020. And we're going to talk first about sort of where it came from, what the motivation for it is, what the policy actually sort of expects, and requires. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the guidance and kind of related resources that we have available for people as they're thinking about putting this policy into practice. So first off, why does NIH want scientific data to be shared? There's a number of different reasons, that are actually described in the policy, and the policy has kind of a lengthy preamble, explaining a lot of these things. But I really want to highlight what I think are the two main reasons that NIH wants data to be shared. So first off, NIH wants to advance the rigor and the reproducibility of the research that we support. Sharing data helps to enable the validation of published research results. Making data available also helps to ensure that data sets that have been the subject of sort of considerable investment and are high value can be made accessible for others to use as well. Making data available in a timely way helps to accelerate future research. And making data available that underlies things like publications also increases the opportunity for citation of work and recognition of researchers' contributions, as well as fostering collaboration between different research teams. But in addition to these sort of scientific motivations, I want to point out, some public policy interests that we have as well. So we really want to promote public trust in the research that we support. Sharing data helps to foster transparency and accountability in publicly funded research and demonstrates good stewardship over taxpayer funds. I think it also helps to maximize research participants' contributions by recognizing the sort of time and sacrifice that they make to contribute to research. And anytime we issue a policy is another opportunity to sort of reaffirm appropriate protections for research participants' data. But I don't want to give you the impression that this is the first data sharing policy that NIH has had. We've actually had them going back as far as 1989 in various cases. But at the agency level, so things that apply to everything the agency does, the first real policy was in 2003 with the NIH data sharing policy, followed in 2007 by the genomic data sharing policy, which I think some of you in this consortium might be actually familiar with, that expects that large sharing of large-scale human and non-human genomic data from studies that NIH funds, typically through a publicly available data repository like the NIH database of genotypes and phenotypes. It also expects the sharing of non-human data, typically through any sort of publicly available repository. We've also had policies that relate to registration and submission of summary results to a website called clinicaltrials.gov in a sort of timely way for clinical trials specifically. So those are policies that exist at sort of the agency level, but they've also existed kind of more locally within the agency. So for example, several parts of the agency follow the NIH data sharing policy for autism data. And then several parts of the agency called institutes and centers have their own policies as well. So for example, the NIMH has a data sharing policy, and NHLBI also has its own data sharing policy. And sometimes large programs within the agency will also establish their own data sharing policies as well. So the NCI Cancer Moonshot is a good example, as is the HEAL program. Both of these have policies that expect the sort of timely sharing of data, as well as access to publications resulting from their funded research. But despite this, we are aware of growing literature demonstrating a poor availability of data underlying published peer-reviewed work. So these are just three examples from 2021 and 2022, so fairly recent. where people have looked at what the actual availability is of data underlying publications. In the first example, 875 papers across 9 disciplines, including many in the life sciences, published over about the last 20 years. Authors attempted to obtain data underlying them and were only successful about 40% of the time. And that went up with repeated follow-up, but 20% of the time their request to access those data was just outright declined. In another one from late 2021, and this is part of a series of efforts trying to replicate 193 experiments from 53 high-impact cancer biology papers, the authors were only able to obtain data, actually were not able to obtain data for 68% of those actually reported experiments. And in the last example, which got some press in the US when it came out, there was about 1,800 papers published in one journal in January 2019 that had data availability statements. The authors were not able to obtain data 93% of the time for those papers. So these are papers that even had, a statement saying whether and where data would be available, and they weren't able to get those data 93% of the time. So we can do better than this, and I think the public generally expects us to. So this is a survey of U.S. adults asking them, what factors would cause them to trust the results of scientific research more. And the number one factor that they listed are that data are openly available to the public. So in recognition of these issues, and also in response to sort of mandates that we have from the U.S. White House and from the U.S. Congress, we started a sort of policy development process where we engaged with different communities and stakeholders over a span of about 10 years. There was a memo that came out in 2013, which is sort of what directed U.S. departments and agencies to begin taking efforts like this one. We first signaled in 2015 that we were going to change that 2003 policy that I mentioned earlier by getting rid of the sort of cost threshold in it and making it apply to everything. And in 2016 and 2018, we issued sort of requests for information to learn more about various aspects of how a data management and sharing policy could work. In 2019, we put the draft policy out for public comment. We also started a formal tribal consultation process, which is a process in the US where the federal government sort of formally engages with sovereign tribes in the US. And then we also got sort of formal recommendations from the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections and from other US departments and agencies. So all of that feedback was used to revise that 2019 draft and resulted in the final version of the policy that was issued in October 2020. And we decided that we needed to give people a fair amount of time to understand the policy and to come into compliance. So it won't be taking effect until this week, basically. So there's been over 2 years since it's been out. So now I'll talk a bit about the policy itself and what it requires and what it expects. So first off, it's fairly straightforward in that it only has 2 basic requirements. So these are things that must be done. So it requires the submission of a data management and sharing plan for all NIH-funded research that would generally describe how, where, and when data will be shared. And it also requires compliance with the version of the plan that is approved by the NIH Institute Center or office that funds the research. And we do say in the policy that compliance with that plan can affect future funding decisions. It will actually become effective for new and competing awards on January 25th, 2023. And what that means is that applications that are submitted for that receipt date and later will have to comply with the policy and submit a data management and sharing plan. For those awards, it will replace the 2003 policy going forward. So effectively, this will be sort of phasing in applications as they are submitted to NIH. But existing awards that were awarded in previous years that are still ongoing now will not have to comply with the policy until their next competing application. So in terms of the kinds of activities that are subject to the data management and sharing policy, we've provided a fairly comprehensive list on a website called sharing.nih.gov, which I will be talking about a bit more in this presentation. But in short, it applies to research projects, as well as things like SBIR and STTR awards, so small business awards. Although there are some special considerations for those. It also applies to things like research centers, but it does not apply to research projects that generally do not generate scientific data or are not doing research. So for example, all training and fellowship awards are not required to be subject to this policy. Things like construction or for research related infrastructure, that's not part of this policy. They do not have to submit a data management and sharing plan. So to drill down a bit more in terms of what the policy applies to, so it applies to all NIH-supported research that generates scientific data. Scientific data are also what we generally expect people to address sharing in their data management and sharing plan. And it's specifically defined in the policy as the information that are of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether those data are used to support scholarly publications or not. So it really relates to the proposed research questions, and the findings can include things like unpublished null results. But we have specifically not included in that definition things like laboratory notebooks or preliminary analyses or completed case report forms, from clinical trials, or any kind of physical object. So like biospecimens, for example, are not expected to be shared in this policy. In terms of the timelines for sharing data, there's really sort of two ways to think about this. So first off, when data should be shared, what the policy says is that we expect the sharing of data that underlie peer-reviewed journal articles no later than the time of publication of that article. And for scientific data that underlie any other kind of finding, that those would be shared no later than the end of the award. And in terms of how long data should be shared once they have been made available, the policy doesn't provide a specific timeline for that, but what we are asking people to do is to consider other relevant requirements that they might be subject to. So for example, journal policies or repository policies, or in some cases, even things like record retention policies that might come with your award. To think about those as being the minimum time frame that you should propose sharing your data for. And in some cases, the repository that you share your data in may tell you how long they're going to make the information available for. So in terms of the plans themselves, I mentioned in some earlier slides that the policy only has two basic requirements. It requires the submission of a data management and sharing plan and compliance with the version of the plan that is approved by the funding institute or center. It does not directly require data sharing, but it does expect that in drafting your plans, applicants will maximize appropriate data management and sharing. And in order for sharing to be appropriate, we recognize that there must be certain, justifiable limitations. In general, what the policy says is that there are, acceptable ethical, legal, and technical factors that might necessitate limiting sharing to some degree. And what the policy really emphasizes is that all data should be managed, but not all data, can or must be shared. Sharing should be responsibly implemented, and plans should outline how the privacy, the rights, and the confidentiality of research participants will be protected. And of course, researchers have to continue abiding by any, applicable existing laws, regulations, or policies. So for example, in the US, things like HIPAA and the HIPAA privacy rule, or the common rule for the actual protection of research participants, those must continue to be followed. Or in some cases, things like state laws must continue to be followed. There's no choice about that. I also want to point out that policies would include NIH policies as well, and in some cases, even other NIH data sharing policies that predate this one that may establish more specific expectations for sharing. So they may establish a specific repository they want things to be shared in, or a specific timeline they want things to be shared to. And in general, I think part of what this policy is trying to achieve is to really get people to prospectively plan for data management and sharing from the beginning of the process. So, I mentioned that there can be potential, limitations on sharing. These would generally all be expressed in data management and sharing plans if they do exist. There's a frequently asked question on this topic on the sharing.nih.gov website that I mentioned. And so, it's I think tried to provide some examples of what could constitute justifiable, ethical, legal, and technical factors that might necessitate limiting sharing of data to some degree. Just to walk through a couple of examples here. So, these could include where informed consent will not permit or would limit the scope of sharing or use of data from human research participants, where the privacy or safety of research participants would be compromised and available protections like certificates of confidentiality wouldn't be sufficient to protect them, where there are explicit federal, state, local, or tribal laws, regulations, or policies that prohibit disclosure, those must be followed, and this would be the same in countries outside the United States as well. Where there are, actual sort of limitations or restrictions that would be imposed by existing or anticipated agreements with other parties. Or in some cases, we recognize that data sets may not always be sort of practically, digitized. And so it might be reasonable to, not share those in some cases. There are some reasons we've sort of indicated are not generally justifiable to limit sharing, and these include when data are too small, when researchers anticipate that data would not be widely used, or just because they're thought to not have a suitable repository. And of course, there's a couple of other situations too where there are kind of additional considerations that come into play that might necessitate limiting sharing. When we're working with U.S. tribes, that's a particular group that we've offered some sort of additional guidance about, which I'll say more about later. And when we're talking about SBIR and STTR awardees who may be able to withhold data for 20 years after the date of award. So in order to help explain sort of what makes a good data management and sharing plan, we published alongside the policy a series of supplemental information documents, and one of them contains the recommended elements of a plan. So this includes describing the type of data that will be produced and the metadata, and which will be sort of preserved and which will be shared, what the rationale for doing so is, and if there's any kind of documentation that will be shared along with it. Whether there are any tools, software, or code that would be needed to access and to manipulate the data. This policy is not expecting people to share software and code, although I do recommend that you make sure you look carefully at the language of your funding opportunity announcement to make sure that there's not an additional expectation there. But this would generally be to make sure that people understand whether there's something that's needed in order to use your data. What sort of standards data and metadata will be collected with. What the sort of preservation and access and timeline considerations look like. So this is where you would describe what repository you're going to submit and share your data through, whether there's going to be things like persistent identifiers to help find them, and sort of when and how long data will be made available for. There's also, an element for access, distribution, and reuse considerations. And this is where you would describe if there are any, potential limitations on sharing, like I just described on the prior slide. And it's also where you would indicate, if you're planning to control access to data or to make it available in a sort of unrestricted way. And then the last element, kind of relates to the oversight of data management and sharing. So that includes sort of describing generally who will be sort of responsible for monitoring compliance with the plan. I do want to indicate that this is not something that we've said has to be done by any particular person. So institutions do have some flexibility to sort of say who this should be. So to help people sort of get started, in drafting those, we've provided an optional plan format page on a list of format pages that we have, and it's incorporated into our current set of instructions. It's generally recommended to be no more than 2 pages in length, but we do understand that there may be some research projects where, for example, there's just a really large number of data types, and so it may not be possible to keep plans under 2 pages in every case. So the system will accept plans that are longer than 2 pages. And what I'm showing here is sort of a brief clip of it, but this is something that we'll be working on over time. This is a fairly simple document. But we do have a sort of pilot project going on right now to sort of understand how we might better turn this into a, like more of a structured data collection instrument. So one other aspect of the policy I really want to highlight for you is that it really emphasizes the use of established repositories as the preferred method of sharing. And to help people do that, we've issued a supplemental information that lays out kind of desirable characteristics that repositories should really have for sharing. As well as sort of a kind of stepwise consideration for how to select them. I do want to point out that the policy does not require the use of a specific repository, and it does not say that those repositories must be NIH funded. However, there may be other policies that you could be subject to that would indicate a specific repository should be used. So for example, some of those ones I showed earlier, like NIMH and NHLBI, may direct you towards a specific repository, as well as things like the genomic data sharing policy may indicate a certain set of repositories. So just pay attention to those as you're doing your applications. The supplemental information really kind of prioritizes data type and discipline-specific data repositories first. And we have provided on the sharing.nih.gov website a sort of non-comprehensive list of NIH-supported data repositories like this to make available for people so they can look for various things like this. There's a couple of examples here at the bottom, but that's not the only place you can find kind of lists of repositories. If there are no sort of appropriate discipline or data type specific repositories, certainly there are other acceptable options. So things like institutional type repositories, we've seen a number of institutions creating those. In some cases, PubMed Central may be an acceptable way of sharing things like small data sets that are submitted with manuscripts, although you have to pay attention to things like the embargo date to make sure that you're being compliant with the policy. And what we're also seeing is that there's a really kind of growing ecosystem emerging of what are called generalist data repositories. So these are repositories that are designed to take data from a variety of different research and sort of data types. So there's a couple of examples here at the bottom. And we've actually had a series of efforts working with them to try and get them to be more sort of in line with the policy and the FAIR principles. And so there's been a series of workshops to help people kind of learn more about these repositories and what options exist. There's one coming up starting tomorrow and the day after as well. One of the things we heard during the public comment process was that there was a lot of interest in terms of what NIH was expecting informed consent for research participants to look like, as it relates to data sharing. So we create, I do want to be clear that the policy, is not setting any sort of specific expectations for informed consent. And I have heard people say on a number of occasions that they think this policy requires broad consent for future sharing. That is not actually the case. The policy does not require that consent be obtained in any particular way. But to help people think through sort of how you might be able to incorporate language relating to sharing of data and future use of those data, we provided a sort of, resource document that you can see here to help people think through what that language might look like. It includes some sample language as well as points to consider, along those. It's not a requirement to use it, it's just meant to be helpful. Similarly, we heard a number of questions about privacy. And so to help people, kind of understand, how they might be able to go about sharing data in a way that protects research participant privacy, we generated a sort of basic framework for people, to consider as they're planning data management and sharing. It's not intended to be a guide for regulatory compliance, so it will not tell you, for example, what you need to do under the Common Rule or under HIPAA. It's intended to be used in a bunch of different research contexts, and what it does is it provides a set of principles. It describes one set of best practices. There may be others, but it just sort of describes one in here, and a certain set of considerations for whether to control access to data or not. So to just focus on the best practices provided in that document, what it does is it first recommends that data be de-identified to the greatest extent possible while maintaining scientific utility. And to do this by using the regulatory standard for de-identification that is actually available in the Common Rule and in the HIPAA privacy rule. But even then, we are still asking people to consider what risks there might be, even when sharing de-identified data, and to share identifiable data under that standard that I just described, only when there is explicit informed consent to do so. Second, and this is something we want people to do in addition to what I just mentioned, is to use agreements to cover the transfer of data. So these agreements should really communicate where there are limitations on the subsequent use of data, for example, because of informed consent, and to do things like include prohibitions on re-identifying or recontacting people. And last, we really want people to be aware of sort of the legal environment and framework that they're working in, and to consider, what are the sort of specific legal requirements for sharing data in their context. We also, as a result of the sort of tribal consultation that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation, we developed a specific supplemental information that relates to responsible management and sharing when working with U.S. tribes. So it's really intended to help sort of develop appropriate data management and sharing plans in that context. It emphasizes sort of respect for tribal sovereignty, entering into sort of partnerships and mutual agreements, as researchers sort of begin their research planning process, and really building trust between the different parties involved. And as I mentioned, this was sort of a product of that tribal consultation process, and also went through a sort of public engagement process as well. So just to kind of highlight a couple of the features of this supplemental information. So, we're really asking researchers to understand the tribal sovereignty and the laws, regulations, policies, and preferences that come with tribal sovereignty, to engage as early as possible with tribes when developing a data management and sharing plan before the research begins, and to sort of continue that engagement throughout the research process, to make sure that they're sort of entering into mutually beneficial partnerships with the tribe, and in that process to really agree on some important points, particularly early on, about things like who will manage the data and who will be responsible for sharing it, whether that's the tribe or the researcher or a trusted third party. Those are all things that should be worked out, and to consider additional protections as necessary, given what may be extra, vulnerabilities in this set of communities. So with that, I will turn it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Taunton. So NIH does realize that managing and sharing data in a way that will allow your scientific data to be accessible and reusable by other research may incur costs. And so NIH has described what type of costs might be allowable for certain types of activities that would be proposed in your data management and sharing plan. And the types of reasonable costs that may be allowed as direct costs in your budget request, first, I'll note that they must be incurred during the performance period of your project. And these costs can be requested for activities such as curating data, developing supporting documentation, preserving and sharing data through repositories, as well as local data management considerations, so getting your data ready for sharing. There are other types of costs that, while they relate to data sharing, they will not be considered direct data sharing costs for the purposes of budget requests. And this would include activities such as infrastructure costs that are already included within an institution's indirect costs, so things that are not project specific. And there are other types of costs that are considered associated with the routine conduct of research, and that includes things like gaining access to other research data. In terms of the actual dollar amounts of what sharing will cost, well, that's something that will certainly vary by context, depending on your data type, on the area of science that you're conducting. But with that said, over time, after this policy goes into effect, NIH does hope to learn more about what constitutes reasonable costs for various types of data management and sharing related activities. Next slide, please. Now I want to give an overview of how the data management and sharing plan will be submitted and reviewed. And I'll note that this is specific to extramural grant awards, but there are analogous requirements in place for other types of funding, including contracts, other transaction awards, and NIH intramural research program projects. So for grant awards, the data management and sharing plan will be submitted with the application for funding, and there will be a brief plan description along with some cost information and the budget justification. But the full plan, and that's that roughly 2-page document, which should cover the elements that Taunton talked through earlier, that will be submitted as a separate attachment in a different part of the application. In terms of how the plan will be assessed, peer reviewers will not be judging the adequacy of the plan. They may comment on the budget, and just as they comment on other types of costs, if they have comments to offer on the reasonableness of the budget, they may do so. That will not impact the score, however. And it is NIH program staff who will be assessing the plans to determine if they are acceptable or not. If there are any issues with the plan that was submitted in the application, then the program staff would reach out to you to discuss and ask for any clarification or additional information that might be needed. The goal is to get these plans into shape so that they can be approved. If there are any changes that need to be made to ensure that these plans are kept up to date and accurately reflect what your plans are for the project, you will have an opportunity to revise those as needed. So after an award is made, the approved data management and sharing plan will be incorporated as a term and condition of your award. So again, emphasizing that recipients do need to follow through with the plans that are described there. And compliance with the plans that are described there will be monitored at regular reporting intervals. While there are still some details to be worked out, at a high level, this will be done as part of the annual reporting process, as part of the RPPR. And compliance with that approved plan may factor into future funding decisions. So again, just to emphasize that we do need to make sure that you are following through with these plans. Next slide, please. So while today we are covering a lot of information about how to prepare for this policy, this is not your only opportunity to get this information. So I want to point out where you and anyone else can go to on NIH's website to find all the information we're presenting here today. So we have a central scientific data sharing website, which you can access at sharing.nih.gov. And this is intended to provide a central source of guidance, both for the data management and sharing policy, which we're describing today, but also other central NIH data sharing policies. And so it includes information on the data management and sharing policy, the genomic data sharing policy, as well as model organism sharing policy and research tools policies. And as NIH has additional information, this website will be updated, so it can always be the first place to go to make sure you have access to up-to-date information. Next slide, please. So we have a number of resources on this website, and here this is just a screenshot showing kind of how to reach the different parts of the website. And I'll highlight what's available here under the data management and sharing policy. But there's also ways to access the information about the other sharing policies, which your work may be subject to as well. Next slide, please. So first, what resources are available for planning and budgeting for data management and sharing? We have a section on writing a data management and sharing plan, which provides expectations for developing your plan in terms of the content as well as the format document. You can access that there. And it also summarizes the instructions for preparing this attachment and attaching that as part of your grant application, and links out to more comprehensive grant application instructions as well. There's also information on budgeting for data management and sharing, covering what types of costs are considered allowable and how to include that information in your application. Next slide, please. So depending on the research that you are proposing to conduct, you may be subject to other sharing policies as well. And so this website does allow you to explore other NIH sharing policies, has some FAQs to help you understand each policy, and has a tool to help find which policies might apply to your research. Next slide, please. And here is screenshot showing what that tool looks like, and it just kind of steps you through what types of outputs your research will generate to help get an idea before you're even coming in with your application of what sharing policies you might need to account for in your application. Next slide, please. And I will turn things back over to Taunton now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So one of the resources that's available on the sharing.nih.gov website that I think might be helpful to be aware of is a number of sample data management and sharing plans. And what I mean by sample is where that sort of format page that I showed you, a clip of earlier has been filled out as if it were for a real, research application. So these were contributed by a number of different parts of the agency relating to different research types and data types. So there's a pretty good spread right now, all the way from sort of, human, clinical, and genomic research sort of on one end to, model organism research, on the other, with a lot of different, data types represented here. So these are useful. Right now, I think in total on NIH websites, there are about 13 of them made. There are probably going to be more, made available, in the future, and they may be updated over time as well. Right now, it's on the writing a data management and sharing plan part of the sharing.nih.gov website. One thing I want to sort of explain a bit is a bit about what we're doing. So about a year ago, we issued a series of blogs describing sort of a plan for what we'd be doing in 2022 and thinking about 2023 sort of going forward. So these provided kind of a general roadmap, and there's a couple of resources that we said we would be doing that are sort of out now. So first off, there was a 2-part webinar series held over the summer, kind of public facing to provide kind of a very similar background to what we've sort of described today about the policy, and give people a chance to ask questions and have them answered. Those are both available on the sharing.nih.gov website. One other resource that's there that we've been working on and will continue working on into the future are frequently asked questions. So a number of the things I've described today are available as frequently asked questions. Those are, again, on the sharing.nih.gov website. And I would really encourage you to take a look at that if you have questions about the policy. We've done, I think, nearly 30 or so, and they cover a lot of topics, and I've heard from people that they're very helpful. I think I described 2 additional supplemental, information documents that, we issued over the summer as well. One that I want to also make you aware of, because I think some members of this consortium may be familiar with the NIH genomic data sharing policy. So one change that we've done through a notice that we issued over the summer as well is to harmonize the expectation in the genomic data sharing policy where it would normally require a genomic data sharing plan be submitted with the application for funding. We've wrapped that into the data management and sharing plan expectation. So instead of submitting a separate genomic data sharing plan, that will be going away. And instead, what you'll do, if you're also subject to the GDS policy, is you'll just describe your plan for sharing genomic data in your data management and sharing plan. This should make things simpler for everybody. In this year and sort of going forward, we do plan to continue to issue frequently asked questions as we get them. So we get a lot of questions, and sometimes we get ones that we see a lot and we think it makes sense to offer guidance on it, or ones that raise really good questions that we think are important to include on that list. So we'll continue to do that for as long as we need to. We'll also be thinking about what additional guidance we might need. And then one activity that I think is really important that we want to undertake is a sort of ongoing assessment of the policy, both in the sort of short term and in the long term, to understand whether we're kind of meeting our goals and what, if anything, might need to be sort of tweaked about implementation, or whether there's needs for additional guidance and resources and things like that. And last, something that we've heard a lot about and that we're sort of interested in looking into ourselves is the sort of incentive structure for sharing data, and whether we're really providing enough incentives for people to want to do the things that this policy is asking them to do. So we'll be thinking about sort of what options we have as the funding agency to sort of help with that. Okay, one last and slightly different thing that I want to touch on is some of you may be aware that last summer in August, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US issued a new memo for sort of federal departments and agencies, basically asking them to create plans for how they plan to increase access to the results of their research. So it has sort of three main pieces. And the first piece is that publications resulting from federally funded research should be made available in publicly accessible repositories without embargo, so and no paywall. That scientific data that underlie those publications should be made accessible, at the time of publication, and that agencies, should start thinking about how they want to share data that don't underlie publication, and that there should be an effort to sort of collect appropriate, metadata from publications, and to use persistent identifiers for a whole range of things, including publications, data, researchers, institutions, that kind of thing. What I want to say about this is that we're working on our plan as required by that memo, and we will be submitting it to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. It will also be made publicly available. And if we change any of our existing policies, we will be seeking public comment on that. And one point that I want to make is that where it says that scientific data underlie publications, should be made, publicly accessible, we feel that our policy that I've just described today will already do that. So we do not anticipate making any changes to this policy in response to this memo. So here's a number of resources, most of which I think we have, gone over today. So I see there's, a number of questions in the chat, so I'll stop there. Thank you. And Francis, I don't know if you sort of have a preference here, but we're happy to maybe just sort of go down the list, of questions we've received. Cindy, I don't know if that works for you.
Yeah, that sounds fine. And the first one I did address in the chat, and I think you spoke to it later, just pointing out that with the blank format page, kind of the template, as well as the completed examples, can be found on the scientific data sharing website. And Taunton, the next question from Bill Hirsch looks like that would be for you. What proportion of data from clinical research studies and trials has protected health information? Won't all of this data not be shareable?
Sure. So just because something is protected health information under HIPAA doesn't necessarily mean it's not shareable. So one of the things we've described in the supplemental information that relates to to protecting privacy is that we would expect things to be de-identified under HIPAA, and we've provided information about informed consent for being able to get people to provide informed consent for appropriate sharing of their data. So there are certainly ways that you can share data in a way that protects privacy, even if the original data are protected health information under HIPAA. That said, we still recognize that there may be cases where that's just not possible, particularly if there are laws, and some countries, obviously have different laws, about privacy than the US does, and they may set more sort of specific expectations that may not be able to be met, just by following those guidelines specifically. So there will certainly be some that can't be shared. I think the important thing to do is to make sure that you address those limitations in your data management and sharing plan.
And the next question was just about the slides, and we will get the slides to Francis, and he'll make sure that everyone who was here has access to those. And next question, Taunton, I'll pose that to you. Are the guidelines for the AI-AN participant data translatable and applicable to African tribal data?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that we developed that supplemental information, as part of a very specific process that was undertaken, where the federal government sort of formally consults with the leadership of federally recognized tribes, so 530 plus tribes at this point. That said, one of the things we heard was interest in understanding how this could apply, to other groups in the US and outside the US. So we do think that there are kind of, a lot of basic provisions in there, things like engaging early and consultation as early as possible in the process, and really, coming to agreement on issues like who is going to manage the data, that those are things that should be broadly applicable for really working, with any group. But I think that you would have to think carefully about, what the specific application to any particular group should be.
And the next question, I'll take, it's a budget question. So Eileen asks, will there be exceptions for infrastructure costs to be included in direct costs if the FOA or RFA requires that the PI/PD institution be non-US, i.e. an African institution, such as many and DSI Africa and Fogarty FOAs, given the small indirect rate for non-US institutions? I will just respond initially that the supplemental policy information on allowable costs that I referred to earlier, that is very specific. The infrastructure costs are not considered allowable direct data management and sharing costs. But in terms of whether there's any additional guidance that can be offered for non-US institutions with smaller indirect rates, I can bring that question back to our budget experts to discuss further and see if there's any information that would be helpful. Next question, does this data management plan apply to genomic data only or any kind of omics data? Jonathan, you want to handle that one?
Sure, yeah. So the data management and sharing policy relates to scientific data, which could be omics data, could be genomic data, could be other kinds of data as well. So yes, it's inclusive of all of those things. The genomic data sharing policy that I mentioned earlier is really focused on large-scale human and non-human genomic data, and there's a sort of specific definition in that policy of what that means. What that would mean in this case is that, it's the same data management and sharing plan that you're using for both of those things. But for the genomic data sharing policy, if your research is subject to that, there may just be additional expectations that you have to address in the data management and sharing plan in order to satisfy that policy.
And the next question, what about large data sets used to train clinical machine learning models?
Yeah, so what matters here is whether it sort of meets the definition of scientific data and would generally expect it to be shared. So that's the information that's of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings. There's a number of sort of other qualifiers that I haven't gotten into today. And this includes, for example, if you're doing secondary research, so if you're accessing data that's already available somewhere else, you're not expected to share those data because they're not your data and you can't do that. There are some sort of qualifiers here that might come into play for things like what you're describing.
That's the last question I'm seeing in the chat here. If anyone does have questions afterwards, you can reach out to us on the sharing website. We have a central email address, sharing@nih.gov, and that's available to anyone, any researchers out there, or as well as inside the NIH. So any general questions, you can always reach out to us afterwards.
It seems that there are no more questions for Cindy and Tonton. I'd like to thank Cindy and Tonton so much for taking the time to engage us. And it is indeed a wonderful talk and a webinar. So to the participants, the recording and then the presentation slides will be made available to you all. And also the question that Cindy will follow up, once she gets response, I'll also circulate that to all those that registered. So we have the emails for all of you on the call now because you registered. Yeah, so that is it for the webinar. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for having us.
Sure.